So the topic of pastoral systems, in the last presentation, we talked quite a bit about territoriality and defense of territory and use of territorial resources. But we didn't talk at all about tenure, property. And of course, property comes from the state. There are few indigenous groups that would say we have a formal property system. But of course, they have a system of rights and claims. And that often is, in a customary system, is in some form of articulation with a state-based system of land tenure. Interestingly, the rangelands in the Maasai areas have gone through an evolution, in some sense, in the vanguard of all other pastoral regions of the world. And therefore, it's probably experienced some of the problems that others will experience if they're not headed off by people recommending that they adopt another path. The Maasai are side by side with a number of highland cultivating groups, and you could say central province in Kenya, and the northern region of Tanzania involves some of the most fertile land, and it's excellent for agriculture, for food crops, for coffee, for tea, etc. So they're very, very lucrative areas. When you drop off the highlands, you come to the lowlands. This is primarily where the pastoralists live. But in the history of both Kenya and Tanzania, they've been influenced by the highland areas. There was an explicit decision in Kenya made in the late 50s that a program of privatization, consolidation of land, adjudication of land, and then rendering title deeds would be carried out in the highland areas. But they explicitly set aside the lowlands and said, no, we're not going to privatize these areas because, for a number of reasons, the population isn't ready for it. The dynamic of fragmentation, if it is pursued, would end up in non-viable, non-ecological, non-economic levels of holding. So therefore, they came up with the idea in the early part of the 1960s, just before and after independence was attained, of creating group ranches. Group ranches were intended to bring together a certain collectivity of people within the sections that I had talked about, which are territorial units. They would often be divided into 4, 5, 10 group ranches. So large, but not as large as the territory that they had before. By having a group ranch, it brought together a certain group that would use that land in principle, and they would have rights to use it. They would be governed by a set of representatives who would form a committee, and the committee itself was elected by the members. So it all sounds very sensible, and in fact could have been, and perhaps even can be, in some instances, made successful. The group ranches, it was actually the subject of one of my very first publications when I looked at why have they accepted group ranches rather than trying to stick with their territorial section. And my conclusion was that they were feeling land insecure. They felt we better establish something which has a formal status, and our rights will be encoded within the title deed that is held for the group ranch. So it was insecurity that drove them to do that. One of the reasons that group ranches were formed was that the developers, that is to say both the bureaucrats and international donors, were seeing that some of the pastoralists in the Maasai area were taking relatively large areas for their personal individual ranches. And they began to do the arithmetic and realized that if that continued, there would not be enough land left for the people who were, might say the common people, who are using it for animal husbandry and that need a place to be. So the group ranches was intended on the one hand, to head off the private individuals who wanted to grab more land, and on the other hand, to provide a structure for the efficient management of the land, and actually a place where they hoped that there would be steps taken towards modernization of animal husbandry. Those hopes were in general not realized, in the sense that the group ranch itself became a unit in which people identified with it. They lived and they interacted together, but it wasn't very successful as a unit of development. That doesn't mean development didn't take place, because at the same time we have the Maasai community was in experiencing the spread of education, of which my early participation as a teacher was part. They were experiencing an interest in the market, having things as mundane as soda pop. Suddenly is something that they're interested in having. So each family had a certain number of things that they wanted to have, and so they were selling more animals, and there was much more dynamic involvement in the market. Now, that doesn't say that they hadn't wanted to market their animals before. In fact, in the colonial period, it's very intriguing, because they agreed during the Second World War that they would make a contribution to the war effort by providing so many animals from each area towards the war effort, and this would be used to support the troops. And they were paid a certain amount. After the war, they said, okay, well, that's that. But of course, the government had something else in mind. The government wanted to continue having them produce animals for the market at a very low price. Turned out that they basically stalled, and they said, no, that wasn't our agreement. And we know what the value of these livestock are. Why? Because we have areas in the highlands, both in Tanzania and Kenya, where they're making a lot of money. They're selling coffee, and they have all this money. And what do they want to invest their money in? Well, livestock, in fact, represents probably as good a bank as any. And the interests, the growth in livestock is actually quite appreciable. So that if you invest in livestock and it grows, the increase in numbers, it's much stronger than if you put the money in the bank. So people were, in effect, coming with coffee money and buying livestock, and it was going back. So they were quite involved in regional trade, but it just wasn't supporting or sustaining the colonial effort at one stage, and then later the independence stage. So there's no reason to think that pastoralists intrinsically do not want to sell animals. They are, in this regard, doesn't mean that they're not culturally oriented, but in this regard, they, in fact, are responsive to the market, and they sell their animals when the price is good, and they hold them off the market when the price isn't. I thought that's what we were all supposed to do, in terms of the sort of neoliberal ethic that we're hearing so much about. Well, the Maasais and other pastoralists have been doing that for a very, very long time. So you have these background dynamics that influence the changing tenure system among the Maasai and others. There's a body of ideas that have been embraced by many of the colonialists, not all, and by many of the officials in the post-colonial government, not all, but many embrace the idea that pastoralism is a negative, has a negative impact on the rangelands, creates degradation, that they occupy the land and it's not used productively, that there is, that they refrain from marketing their livestock because they just want to accumulate animals. None of these really stands up when you examine them one by one. And so what we have is a body of relatively distorted ideas, some of them having a sort of a quasi-scientific aura, which undermines the legitimacy of pastoral land rights. It basically says, you have land, but you don't deserve to have land. Well, I always look twice to see who is going to benefit. And of course, there are people who, if that land was released onto the market, would benefit. So you have the group ranches, and that was created from the period of basically 67, 70, 72 in different places. And in some cases, they are still there. We've carried out a number of projects with a set of graduate students, PhD students. Some of them are coming from the region, who are Maasai scholars. And what we've done is to examine the effects of on landholding of the desire to subdivide group ranches into their individual holdings. Basically, every family gets a piece. Or resistance to that, and a determination to maintain the land holding as it is. And so we have a number of sites which we've been examining over the last decade. And two of the sites have maintained their intact status. And so we've been very interested in what are the factors driving some group ranches to subdivide among the members and end up with effectively family holdings, and others to say no and not to do it. And basically, we've found that in the most important areas where they've maintained collective holding of a common property, effectively, if one wants to follow Elinor Ostrom's framework of thinking. In many cases, these are the ones that are in the drier areas, so it's ecologically less suitable to subdivide, so it's accurate in that sense. But also they have strong leadership, and somehow they've been able to create a feeling of trust with regard to their leadership. That they think the leaders are leading them in the right direction, and they are not going to cheat them. Now you can imagine if you see the opposite, this is the case in many other areas where they are fairly convinced that their leadership will cheat them, that they will take the list of members, registered members for the group ranch, and put other people in, friends, and take others out, and that has happened. So you have a process over the last, say, 20 years where a number of group ranches have subdivided, and it has been an enormous mess. It's been a mess because you have corruption at the level of completing the registry. You have people receiving land who shouldn't, and people who should receive land who don't. You're finding people who are paying to get their names on the list. So what part of our work has been looking and very carefully at enumerating the different flaws in the process that has ended up with corruption and subdivision where probably it shouldn't have occurred. One of the things that people do is somebody on the outside will want to have a piece of land. They'll come and they'll look and they'll spot a piece of land they want. They'll go through a particular person they're going to buy it from. They'll insert their own name, and they will go to the head of the queue because they might bribe the chairman of the committee, and therefore they'll get a choice piece of land while all the other members are getting less choice pieces of land. And the person who is basically selling the land does it before, and they're basically removed from the register. So it's strictly illegal. If there was a strong and principled administrative body in the Ministry of Lands, it would be completely unacceptable. But this is done. So there's corruption that is introduced at that point. The other, and what that leads to is the outcome of many people who get their private piece of land and with a title deed. Many of them sell. You can say, why would they sell? Well, for many, the piece of land is not really big enough, the way they've chopped it up, to use effectively. So that may be a good judgment, actually. We'll invest the money somewhere else. Some of it is sold for no good reason, somebody who wants to simply live it up and pretend like the money that he got will last forever. It's an old story, but there it is. People who then spend the next 2 years in bars and buying cars that then are crashed, et cetera, and then the money's gone. Some people simply have no idea how to manage money. These are essentially agrarian people who, many of whom at that age group are non-literate. And so it's not as if they have a flow of information coming in about how to manage their financial affairs. So those who would support subdivision, many of them are simply afraid that if they wait, they're not going to have a piece of land at the end because they can't trust their leadership. And that's probably not a bad assessment. So one of the students who did a master's looking at the problem of corruption in a particular site in Narok district is actually coming back to do a PhD, and I'm sure he'll do a brilliant job. And he's been looking at this process from the inside, and in fact the NGO that he's inspired and created has now put a legal stop, and it was about to be subdivided in a certain way, and they got it rolled back. So we're basically involved in observing these processes, but through our partners and collaborators, we're able to get an inside view, and hopefully through the work that we've done have some sort of impact on the resilience of people who are either saying no to subdivision altogether or saying it has to be done in a proper fashion. So what we see then is an area that is ecologically best managed in very, very large parcels because of the reasons I described before. You have to be able to move livestock between different areas for wet season and dry season grazing. The very way that you use land in grazing land areas is what we might call opportunistic. If there's rain over there, everyone goes and profits from that. And you do that quickly and you do that effectively. The notion of sitting on, in an arid land, sitting on a small area of your own because you own it and praying for rain is not very effective. One aspect of arid land rainfall dynamics is that it's very irregular. It varies dramatically. So you might, on average, get a certain amount of rainfall, but it tends to fall there or there and not here and here. And in that regard, just looking at the management dynamics, you want to have a large piece of land so that you can use it effectively, and mobility is absolutely the key. You want to be able to move your livestock very quickly to the place where there is grass. Now, how does that articulate with sedentarization? So we have the state, and many people by their own choice are wanting to settle. And settling, of course, is understandable for many reasons. Many want to settle to get their children into school, to get access to a market. They're tired of moving around. They have a job, et cetera, et cetera. So there are attractions. You might say small towns in particular are magnets for people coming in and living there and in the vicinity for all kinds of reasons that we as sedentary people quite understand. It doesn't mean that the land should be managed in that regard or in that way. People can settle their livestock and continue to move. But if it's fragmented, which is a process of fragmentation, which is underway and is becoming worse and worse, then the potentiality of using different pieces of land effectively, depending on the weather and depending on the potential of the grazing regime right there, that will be lost. So what we have is fragmentation, creation of relatively non-viable blocks of land that people are holding, and that has its cost. So the story of the transformation of grazing lands into formally held parcels has gone on over the last century. You originally had something called the Maasai Reserve. I didn't talk about that, but it's at the beginning of the 20th century. You had white settlers coming in. Basically, there was a treaty that gave them a certain parcel of land and allocated pastoralists to the reserve. Then you had the creation of section boundaries that I talked about, the territorial section. And then you had the creation of group ranches. And then you finally have private land. So you have smaller and smaller units, which I guess if we follow the line of James C. Scott, we could see these as ways that the state is trying to make people legible, visible, understandable, and you can do that more and more effectively as you have smaller parcels and people sort of are forced to stay where they are. The fact that it's not very viable as a strategy for animal husbandry, I think, is what's crucial here. To continue thinking about the effects of land fragmentation, we might consider who is it who profits or benefits from having a parcel of land which is relatively small. Obviously, people who are fully engaged in pastoralism won't benefit particularly from that, or they'll have to develop strategies for sharing with one another, putting together a little consortium, so we can move here with a friend who's far away, come to my place under other conditions. Or some people will end up essentially going and leasing land in different places so that their livestock herd can be managed. So it's completely changing the pastoral system to one that is essentially trying to exploit whatever is available in other places for herds that must, because of the nature of animal husbandry, must keep moving. But what I'd like to point out is that, as I described earlier, for a Canadian farming household, you have a family of, say, 4 or 5 children, and one is going to be designated as the person to continue the farm, and the others will leave to do something else. But in the context of Kenya, there's a long tradition of land being parceled out between all the male children. And now, because of a new constitution that was passed in 2010, female children should also be taken into account. And what that means is somebody who's gone off to the city remains a member of a group ranch, now is a lawyer or a business person or lives in the city and does something else, still can retain their claim on that property and those rights. In some ways you can say, well, that's good because it sort of avoids having this split between country and town. It's got some value. However, it means that the people who are in a position, by virtue of having an additional source of money because they have jobs, etc., additional source of prestige, and perhaps even power, are able to come back into the rural area and have a disproportionate effect on decisions that are being made by the society and by the group that has control over the land. What are they going to do with the land? Well, some of them are accumulating land because they have some money, they can buy land. Some of them are getting their piece of land and selling it. They don't feel they want to keep it. But the people who are there on the land to use the land in a way that is appropriate for the use of animal husbandry, they're in a position basically of losing. And this may be unfortunate for the future productivity of the rangelands. So what we're just describing here is essentially a process of class formation. What we have is a rural society that once had some differences of slightly richer, slightly poorer. The richer tended to take care of the poorer and bring them in as laborers, etc. But not a difference in class that is predicated on quite different sorts of resources. If you have those who are educated, those who have ownership of properties in towns, who have access to the political resources, they know the politicians, and they can have influence over what's decided, suddenly you have a different sort of society. And I think we have to consider that across the rangelands, we're not just talking about the Maasai, although this case, as I mentioned, has gone ahead in terms of the land rights issues. What we're seeing more and more is an evolution of a class system where the exercise of influence by a few is really influencing the future of the many. At the same time, if we want to follow out the land issue, we do find a question of land rights that are being pursued by a relatively novel form of organization. That's the NGO, the non-governmental organization, or a part of civil society, because in most areas of Africa, including the arid lands, you now have, between the government and the community, you have this sort of third party where people, usually somewhat educated, some of them very educated, certainly well-versed in the opportunities to try to go to court, to try to influence politicians, to make testimony before commissions, etc. Suddenly they are able to come in and themselves have an influence. And that's the case that I had mentioned, where they were able to stop a corrupt process of allocation through an organization that was founded by one of our graduate students. That would be a case in point. So now you have a complex society. You don't just have pastoralists and different groups of pastoralists interacting through an age set system. You now have a society where you have those who are educated, those who are urbanized. You have those who are part of government. You have those who are part of civil society. You have some that are involved in diverse non-pastoral pursuits. And so it's a complex set of relationships. Some of our recent work has carried out a survey across 9 sites in Maasai land. We found a number of things. We've looked at livelihoods. What are they doing for a living within a randomly sampled set of households? And we found that there are a good number that are continuing to do pastoralism. In fact, almost all are continuing to do pastoralism in relationship to something else. So you have people who are doing business. That means somebody, let's say, owns a shop, and they're selling goods of one sort or another. Let's say somebody is wage labor. So that means they're going and, let's say, they're being paid by the day in order to dig sand or soil, which is going to be used somewhere else. We have people who are salaried, and that's probably the people who are teachers, people working in clinics or hospitals, people who are working for the government, etc. And these are some of the major ways that people are augmenting their incomes through these activities. We also find a certain number who are pursuing agriculture, and agriculture is very much in these regions secondary to animal husbandry, but it's being used as an additional strategy for making a living. So we can ask ourselves, who's better off today with an economy that has evolved so dramatically from when everybody was a herder? And we find it's usually somebody who combines animal husbandry with something else. And of course, the best combination is salary plus pastoralism, because that means somebody is making money. They're able to basically invest in growth of herds. They're able to sell animals. They're able to live off the animals. These people are in the best situation. Sometimes you have very meager participation in pastoralism plus wage labor. These, of course, are the people who are really sort of drifting to the bottom. They're just managing, and they're managing their outside work is not being used as a source of capital to reinvest in animals. They're just simply they're working in order to simply survive. So you have a range of these possibilities being practiced in pastoral areas, and in that regard, you can no longer simply say, how is the pastoralism going? That's important. And I think there are some who say, well, pastoralists are getting out of pastoralism and doing agriculture. Well, look very carefully. You'll find that they're still involved in pastoralism, but by going into agriculture, what they're doing is either getting money that they can reinvest in pastoralism, or they're getting money that they can use to buy food so they don't have to sell their cows. So if we want to go back to the question of how does the symbolic system of pastoralists guide and direct their practical orientations, and we can see here that effectively they're not against doing diverse things in a complex economy. They do it very readily, but they have a number of objectives in mind. And one is to sustain their pastoralism, because they know at the end of the day, the best use they can make of their land is for animal husbandry. The value of a cow being sold is immense compared to the number of bags of maize that they might sell. So this I'm trying to raise up the transformation in the conditions of occupying and using land by herders in dry lands, where it's no longer just cow land and the use they're going to put that land to. It's now an economy that is national in scope. It has many different forms of occupation. The problem of population growth that I mentioned before is mitigated to some extent by the fact that a good number of people who are raised and grow up in a pastoral household actually find work in towns. So they're not representing. If you have triple the number of people on the land, they're not actually on the land. And the number of herds, the herd size that they have is not triple. The herd is being constrained by ecological limits. They can do various things to try to increase their herds, and they do it so that they can then sell animals. But it's not as if you have 3 times as many people, and that's the worst possible thing for the land. This is just simply not the case. 3 times as many people means an expansion of usually the non-pastoral economy, and that can be good for everyone. So what I've done is gone through describing the evolution and transformation of the landholding system, land tenure, how it's been a disaster for many. I would think that many areas in the arid lands in Africa should avoid the precedent that's being demonstrated by the Maasai in privatization of land. On the other hand, there are responses that they've made to it such that households are making it. Some are doing very, very well. I didn't mention that in Tanzania and Maasai land, you have minerals that have been discovered, and you have some Maasais who are millionaires. And it's a different world. But the main use that this area is put to remains animal husbandry, except in cases, now let me just briefly mention this, in Tanzania, where the landholding system is quite different. You have some built-in stipulations that people have claims, enduring claims to land if they're using it productively. Now, what land use is not productive? Hunting and foraging. You don't, if you hunt and forage, and there are many people who do, you don't get permanent claims to land, and pastoralism. So what that's doing is driving a number of pastoralists to make sure that a good percentage of their land is being cultivated. And this may be areas that surround areas of wildlife conservation, where they're being turned over into fields of grain, simply for the purpose of ensuring that they have maintained their land rights. And this is certainly a very counterproductive strategy on the part of the Tanzanian government. The other thing that's happening is a tremendous increase in the number of court cases that are looking at all the different aspects of land. You feel like somebody has stolen land from you. You feel like the land division process was not just. In one case that we've looked at, there was a group of 14 who took and excised another group from the community's holdings. And then a white entrepreneur came in and over time gradually bought them all out, except for one. And the community itself neither respects the original allocation, which they said was done illegally, nor the legitimacy of this land, which is in the middle of their holdings. And this has exploded into a very, very long and in many ways tedious court case that continues. That in some ways comes into the question of wildlife conservation, which I think we'll have as another topic to come.